The wealthiest families in history did not fear poverty. They feared cash. This sounds backward to modern ears, conditioned to see liquidity as safety and flexibility as power. Today, cash is treated as optional but reassuring, a neutral buffer against uncertainty. For much of economic history, however, holding large amounts of cash was not a sign of prudence. It was a sign of exposure. The richer a family became, the more dangerous cash itself appeared. This contradiction sits at the center of elite wealth behavior. We assume money wants to remain money, ready to move, ready to respond. Yet for generations of rich families, the primary financial challenge was not how to accumulate cash, but how to get rid of it without losing control. Cash was unstable. It demanded constant decision-making. It forced wealth into systems that were young, fragile, and often hostile to concentration. In a world where institutions lagged behind accumulation, liquidity became a liability. The problem was not psychological. It was structural. Cash only feels safe when the systems that protect it are reliable. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, they were not. Banks collapsed without warning. Currencies were tied to political decisions that could change overnight. Markets moved sharply on rumor and panic rather than information. Legal protections for large fortunes were uneven and frequently revised. In that environment, holding cash meant standing still in a fast-moving river. This forced wealthy families into an uncomfortable position. Their success generated surplus faster than existing financial channels could absorb it. Leaving cash idle invited erosion through inflation, taxation, or institutional failure. Actively deploying it in markets increased exposure to volatility. Either way, money demanded attention. It refused to remain passive. The richer the family, the more this problem intensified. The contradiction, then, was not that rich families disliked money. It was that they disliked what money required of them. Cash demanded trust in systems they did not control. It required belief in institutions that had not yet proven durable. It tied fortunes to abstract promises rather than tangible structures. For families focused on continuity rather than acceleration, this was unacceptable. The solution was not to abandon wealth, but to transform it. Cash had to be slowed down, anchored, and embedded into forms that resisted sudden loss. Land, infrastructure, and large estates offered exactly this. They converted financial surplus into physical systems governed internally rather than externally. Once cash was turned into land, buildings, and labor networks, it no longer needed constant supervision. It became quieter, less visible, less reactive. This is where modern interpretations often go wrong. We see the outcome and mistake it for the motive. Mansions appear extravagant, so we assume extravagance was the goal. In reality, the mansion was the byproduct of a deeper discomfort with liquidity. It was an answer to the question of how to hold wealth without constantly defending it. The estate did not eliminate risk, but it reshaped it into forms that felt manageable. This reframing reveals the central tension driving the entire story. Wealth sought stability, but stability required illiquidity. The very act of protecting money required sacrificing its freedom. Cash represented potential, but also vulnerability. Fixed assets represented constraint, but also endurance. Rich families were not choosing between luxury and restraint. They were choosing between exposure and control. Once this tension is understood, many historical behaviors that appear irrational begin to make sense. The reluctance to hold cash was not paranoia. It was an adaptation to a financial environment that punished stillness and rewarded structure. The mansion economy did not emerge because elites misunderstood money, but because they understood its dangers too well. Understanding this changes how we see wealth itself. It's worth pausing here before moving forward. To understand why the rich came to distrust cash, we need to reconstruct the financial logic of the world they inhabited. Wealth accumulation was accelerating faster than the systems designed to manage it. Industrialization compressed generations of capital formation into decades. Railroads, steel, oil, and finance produced surpluses of a scale previously unknown. Yet the institutional infrastructure required to safely hold, diversify, and protect that capital lagged far behind. Banks were not neutral vaults. They were active, fragile intermediaries. Deposits were routinely lent out with limited reserves, and failures were common. When banks collapsed, depositors were often wiped out entirely. There was no deposit, insurance, no central bank backstopping failures at scale, and little recourse once confidence evaporated. For small holders of cash, this risk was tolerable. For families holding fortunes, it was existential. Financial markets offered no refuge either. Stock exchanges were volatile, opaque, and easily manipulated. Information traveled slowly and unevenly. Sudden crashes were not aberrations but recurring events. Large positions could not be exited quietly, and attempts to do so often triggered the very panics families feared. Cash invested in markets did not rest. It remained exposed to sentiment, speculation, and systemic shock. Legal structures compounded the problem. Trust law was evolving. Inheritance frameworks were inconsistent, and the political environment surrounding concentrated wealth was unstable. Large pools of liquid capital attracted attention from regulators and lawmakers seeking new revenue sources. Cash was visible. It was legible. And because it was legible, it was vulnerable. Holding wealth in liquid form made it easier to tax, easier to target, and easier to redistribute under shifting political pressures. Against this backdrop, the hatred of cash was not ideological. It was rational. Cash demanded participation in systems that elites neither controlled nor trusted. It required constant engagement, continuous reinvestment decisions, and exposure to institutions whose rules could change without warning. The opportunity cost of holding cash was not merely foregone returns. It was heightened. Fragility, illiquidity, by contrast, offered insulation. Land could not flee in a panic. Buildings did not collapse because of rumor. Infrastructure retained utility even when markets seized up. These assets were slow, stubborn, and resistant to abstraction. They converted financial value into physical presence, anchoring wealth to geography rather than paper claims. This reduced not only market risk, but political risk as well. Local assets were harder to seize without resistance and easier to justify socially as productive rather than speculative. The mansion economy emerged as a logical extension of this preference. By transforming cash into estates, families replaced exposure with structure. Wealth no longer floated within national or international systems alone. It was embedded in localized networks of land, labor, and production. These networks generated steady, if unremarkable, returns. More importantly, they generated predictability. Financial incentives reinforced this behavior. Tax regimes often favored landholding over liquid wealth. Social and political influence accrued to those who provided employment and stability within a region. Estates created bargaining power. They aligned private wealth with local economies, blurring the line between personal fortune and public utility. In doing so, they reduced the likelihood of hostile intervention. The logic was not to maximize profit, but to minimize surprises. Cash was unpredictable. It demanded agility and constant recalibration. Estates absorbed volatility by slowing it down. They traded speed for endurance. In a world defined by frequent shocks, this trade-off felt prudent. What looks, from a modern perspective, like an aversion to liquidity was in fact a preference for control. Cash placed wealth at the mercy of external systems. Fixed assets allowed wealth to govern itself, at least partially. The rich did not hate cash because it was unproductive. They hated it because it refused to stay put. This is the part of the story that rarely gets discussed. It's worth sitting with this logic before moving deeper. Once cash was converted into land, buildings, and estate infrastructure, It entered a system designed to quiet its volatility. Money stopped behaving like a signal reacting to distant events and began behaving like a resource, circulating within defined boundaries. This shift was not symbolic. It was mechanical. The mansion economy functioned by reorganizing cash flows so that wealth no longer depended on constant external validation. The first transformation occurred at the point of conversion. Cash arriving from industrial profits, dividends, or commercial ventures was deliberately removed for financial circulation. Instead of being reinvested in markets, it was fixed into land purchases, construction, and long-term improvements. This act reduced liquidity, but it also reduced sensitivity. Once embedded, the capital could no longer respond instantly to market swings, which was precisely the point. Within the estate, money moved slowly and predictably. Revenue did not arrive in large, volatile bursts. It accumulated through rents, agricultural output, timber harvesting, and local services. These flows were modest compared to industrial profits, but they were steady. The estate did not need to outperform markets. It needed to remain functional regardless of market conditions. Crucially, expenditures were structured to reinforce internal circulation. Wages paid to workers often returned through rents, purchases, and fees. Supplies were sourced locally. When possible, services were provided in-house. This reduced dependence on external vendors and limited exposure to price shocks. The estate became a semi-closed economy where money entered occasionally but moved continuously. Management replaced speculation as the central financial activity. Stewards, accountants, and administrators monitored flows over seasons and years rather than days and weeks. Decisions prioritized maintenance, balance, and continuity. Capital improvements were evaluated not for rapid payoff, but for their contribution to long-term stability. The goal was not growth, but equilibrium. This system also altered the psychology of wealth. Because capital was tied up in physical and social structures, it demanded patience. Wealth could not be reallocated impulsively. This constraint reduced the temptation to chase returns or react to short-term signals. Illiquidity became a feature rather than a flaw, enforcing discipline through structure. Importantly, the mansion economy did not eliminate risk. It redistributed it. Exposure shifted from financial markets to environmental conditions, labor relations, and political stability. These risks were slower to materialize and more geographically contained. For families seeking generational continuity, this felt manageable. Risk became something to administer rather than something to escape. The system reproduced itself through inertia. As long as revenues covered costs and assets remained productive, the estate could persist with minimal intervention. Cash no longer demanded constant decision-making. It had been converted into processes. This was the quiet power of the model. Wealth stopped asking questions. Yet this same quietness concealed fragility. Because the system depended on balance rather than adaptability, disruptions accumulated silently. Declines in productivity, shifts in labor availability, or changes in external demand could be absorbed for a time, but not indefinitely. The estate functioned best in a stable environment. When stability eroded, so did the logic of containment. Understanding these mechanics reveals why the rich did not merely dislike cash, but actively sought to escape its demands. The mansion economy offered a way to transform wealth from something restless into something governed. It replaced exposure with administration, volatility with routine. Curiosity, not admiration, is the appropriate response here. It's worth holding this image of quiet circulation before examining what finally disrupted it. The mansion economy was built to neutralize volatility, but could not neutralize change. What ultimately undermined the system was not a single crisis, but a slow accumulation of pressures that its internal logic was never designed to absorb. The very mechanisms that once made illiquidity attractive gradually turned into points of strain. The first pressure came from financial modernization. As banking systems stabilized, and capital markets matured, the original danger of holding cash diminished. Institutions learned to manage scale. Insurance mechanisms emerged. Regulatory frameworks reduced the frequency and severity of total loss events. Liquidity, once feared, became useful again. Compared to these new tools, estates appeared cumbersome. Capital locked into land could not be reallocated quickly to take advantage of new opportunities, and the cost of immobility became increasingly visible. At the same time, the internal economics of estates deteriorated. Labor markets shifted as industrial and urban employment expanded. Workers were no longer tied to local estates for survival. Wages rose, mobility increased, and long-standing social arrangements weakened. The internal circulation of money slowed as labor became externalized. Costs increased without corresponding gains in productivity, eroding the balance that had sustained the system. Taxation introduced another structural vulnerability. Governments facing the demands of modern states turned towards stable, visible sources of revenue. Land and estates were easy to assess and difficult to hide. Recurring taxes on property and inheritance transformed illiquidity from protection into burden. Estates required cash to survive, yet their structure resisted generating it quickly. This mismatch forced gradual asset sales, each one weakening the integrity of the system. Cultural legitimacy also eroded. Estates had once justified their scale through employment, production, and local stability. As economies centralized and specialized, that justification weakened. Large estates began to appear inefficient, even obstructive. Political support waned. What had been tolerated as productive capital increasingly looked like locked-up wealth. This shift mattered because the mansion economy relied on alignment between private interests and public tolerance. Most critically, the system lacked adaptability. Estates were designed for continuity, not transformation. When agricultural markets globalized, when transportation networks reconfigured demand, when financial returns elsewhere accelerated, the mansion economy could not respond without dismantling itself. Each adaptation required breaking the internal balance that made the system viable in the first place. The breakdown was therefore gradual and uneven. Maintenance was deferred. Portions of land were sold. Revenue streams shrank. The estate persisted outwardly, while hollowing out internally. Illiquidity, once a shield, became a trap. Cash was needed to survive, yet the system was built to avoid generating it. There was no dramatic failure. No singular mistake. The mansion economy ended because its foundational assumptions no longer matched reality. Stability was no longer scarce. Flexibility was. The hatred of cash that once protected wealth now limited it. What had been rational became restrictive. This was not decline as punishment, but as transition. Wealth did not disappear. It migrated to forms better suited to a faster, more abstract financial world. The mansion economy faded quietly, leaving behind structures that outlived their purpose. There is insight here, not nostalgia. Understanding fragility reveals more than celebrating endurance. The modern world did not make the rich suddenly comfortable with cash. It made cash behave differently. What changed was not elite psychology, but the environment surrounding capital. Financial systems learned how to absorb scale. Markets deepened, diversified, and synchronized. Legal structures matured, offering sophisticated ways to separate ownership, control, and exposure. As these systems evolved, the original threat posed by liquidity diminished. Cash no longer demanded constant escape. In this environment, the logic that once drove wealth into land reversed. Flexibility became an advantage rather than a vulnerability. The ability to move capital quickly, reallocate it across asset classes, and hedge against risk without immobilizing wealth became central to modern strategy. Where old wealth sought to slow money down, modern wealth seeks to keep it light. The hatred of cash faded not because risk disappeared, but because risk could now be managed without physical anchors. This explains why today's richest individuals rarely build self-contained estates as financial centers. Large properties still exist, but they sit at the edge of wealth, not its core. They are expressions of consumption or privacy, not mechanisms of capital preservation. The functions once performed by estates have migrated into abstract systems. Investment vehicles, corporate structures, derivatives, and global portfolios. Wealth no longer needs to hide in land to feel safe. The deeper implication is that wealth always mirrors the systems that surround it. When institutions are weak, wealth becomes territorial. When markets are volatile, wealth becomes fixed. When systems mature, wealth becomes mobile again. None of these behaviors reflect virtue or excess. They reflect adaptation. The rich hated keeping cash when cash exposed them. They embraced it when it stopped doing so. This perspective also reframes modern debates about inequality and visibility. The disappearance of grand, productive estates does not signal a reduction in concentrated wealth. It signals a change in how that concentration is structured. Wealth has become quieter, less visible, and more difficult to locate. Where mansions once stood as obvious anchors, modern capital disperses itself across layers of abstraction that resist physical representation. The mansion economy, therefore, serves as a reminder rather than a model. It shows how rational responses to one set of conditions can appear irrational once those conditions vanish. It also suggests that today's wealth arrangements, however sophisticated they appear, are equally contingent. They function because current systems support them. When those systems shift, new forms will emerge. Seen this way, the rich did not hate cash forever. They hated it when it asked too much of them. They abandoned that hatred when institutions learned to carry the burden. Instead, the story is not about preference, but about pressure. Wealth behaves differently depending on where stress resides. Understanding this does not invite nostalgia for old estates or confidence in modern finance. It invites humility. Every wealth system is temporary, even when it appears permanent. The mansion economy lasted as long as it answered a real problem. Modern capital will be judged the same way. Understanding this changes how we interpret both past and present. It invites us to see wealth not as a fixed state, but as a moving strategy.